Hi, Rolf. I know we've like done this before, like twice, and I feel like since I got to the US, people always talk about like when it comes to like speed power, people always talk about Coach Boo, people always talk about like Dan Path. I don't think people give enough credit to like you, like Rolf Ohman, you and Randy Huntington. So just for those who are not familiar with you, can you like give us like introduce yourself for a little bit?
Right. Well, how do I explain? I'm an Australian that wandered over to Sweden, then wandered back to Australia, got disheartened by the way we treated our athletes, and wandered back to Europe. And then I got persuaded by Randy to come over and work in China. So in 2016, I went to China and had my first job, and then in 2018, I joined the Chinese national team, and I was with them until 19. Then I transferred over to the Chinese Olympic Committee, and I was working for a short time. Actually, I did strength and conditioning with the swimming team, but they didn't want to listen. So that was a pretty short that was a pretty short career. Actually, it was quite funny. But anyway, went home for a little while, and then I was employed as preparation coach, as Olympic preparation coach for a multi-event girl who wanted to try to qualify, and this was during COVID. So we used the Canary Islands and a competition out there, and she qualified, and um, she went to Tokyo and was 10th, and but she didn't. She set a personal record when she qualified, and she was just short of that at the Olympics, but she was 10th. And the results that she did is I think it's still the second best heptathlon ever done by a Chinese. And then in 21, late 21, Hong Kong got a hold of me, and 22 and till midway through 23, so about a year and a half, I was working in Hong Kong as head jumps coach for the Hong Kong Sports Institute. And now I'm back in Sweden again. I'm doing sort of mentoring and education, and um, just doing a lot of stuff with different sports. And of course, looking after I was back at home back in Australia in January, looking after my Australian sprinter, um, who's the only athlete that I coach at the moment. And he's a young fellow that I've been coaching for, I think we're starting our third year. So he's a kid that I picked up who he was basically running sort of 10:50s, and now he's run 10:14. Um, so we're doing pretty well, and I think that the way he's running and what we what we believe that he can do, I think he can run this year if we get some good conditions, which you always need, of course, when you're going to run real fast. I think he can run 10:05, and
Oh,
we'll see how far that will take. The goal is to make the Paris Olympics individually, but also in the Australian 4 by 100 team where he's a member.
nice, nice,
Yeah.
nice. So, since you work with Randy, and Randy also mentioned that Randy kind of like want me to do this with you. So I want, yeah, he's an interesting guy. I love him. So, I want to start with this. I think it's a few months ago I saw you discussing with coach about like dynamic isometric strength. Can you like explain like what exactly is dynamic isometric strength?
Well, to explain that, it's a long story, but we'll try to make it sort of uh, understandable. Um, I in Sweden they were doing a project with elite ice hockey players um, with eccentric training. So basically, they were doing super maximum eccentric loading, with a device that was just lowering at set speeds massive amounts of weight. I mean, they were using like 300 kilos and 350 kilos and stuff like this. And it was a good study, but it was done in one at virtually one, well, not one speed, but it was all very slow. So we're talking 3 seconds was that was a rapid descent. So we're looking at 3, 4, 5, 6 second eccentric and no concentric. And once they lowered the weight, the athlete would just sort of um, either just move out of the way because the bar would then stop and they could just squat down a little bit more and get out underneath it. What we learned from that was that athletes got massively strong. There was no doubt about that. But of course, their power went out the window because they had no power. And if they did have power, it was one or two steps and then it was gone, which, fits, what we know about acceleration. You do deep squats, you're going to get good at acceleration. But once speed picks up, the problem that you've got then is that your ground contact time and your time to peak velocity, which is an acceleration index, they're the same. We look at those as being the same thing. Now, if your TPV is just too slow and you're doing something that's very fast, so let's say that your squats are, like these eccentric squats, they could be anywhere between 550 and 800 milliseconds. Now, Sue, for example, I believe Randy and I were talking about this earlier today, that when Ralph Mann was in Beijing in 21, he measured Sue with ground contact time, and he actually pulled out a 74 millisecond, which is the fastest Ralph has ever measured, which is just ridiculously quick. That is just insane fast off the ground. So if you imagine if you've then got somebody who's getting off the ground at 74 milliseconds and he's doing squats at 800 milliseconds, that's a factor of 10 too slow. So are we going to get any transfer from that? No, none whatsoever. And if we do, it's like one step out of the blocks. You're going to be able to push out of the blocks like crazy, but after that, nothing's going to happen because there is no neural capacity of velocity. So I devised as a system then through a project that was started in Sweden called the 1080 project. Well, it was actually called something else then, but it is known as the 1080 today, and it's the quantum. And with the quantum, what I could do then was load very, very heavily, but when you hit the bottom on the concentric movement, I could, for example, have 200 going down and 100 going up, or 150 down and 60 up. So in other words, I could super maximum load, but then go very quickly in the concentric. So because we know that, if you load the eccentric, it's like loading a spring. You create an enormous amount of elastic energy. And if you release that quickly within 100 milliseconds or faster than 100 milliseconds, you can utilize all the energy that you've stored. If it takes longer than 100 milliseconds before you turn around and go back up, you lose the elastic energy as heat dispersion. So I was doing this project and I'd sort of was fiddling around with this back in 1998. And then we started building this in 2004. And sort of in that space there, I ran into Randy. And he said something which today later on there was a name for it, and that was DIS. And Randy said the following. He said, I don't reckon that in the eccentric phase there is no continuous or complete during the whole phase of lengthening of muscle fibers. I think that in the later parts of the eccentric phase there is an isometric action happening. And I went, yeah, well, that's interesting, because some of the things I'd been measuring and looking at certain athletes that you got in, they were doing things that nobody else could do. And there was nobody, and there was no literature that, I plowed through lots of literature. There was nothing saying, that this would, it was just like, well, they've got more elasticity. Yeah, okay. But they're doing things which is just insane. How can they do that? And then Randy kept, saying this. And then when I started working with Randy, we started looking at this more and more. But even back then it became the sort of the emphasis of our of the backbone of our philosophy in strength and conditioning, and that is that it's not the concentric phase you should be worried about; it's the eccentric phase. So we want to load the eccentric phase, and what we saw was, and this is something that was Randy said already from the beginning. He says, I reckon it works this way. He said because he'd been doing this with Kaiser because Kaiser is a very quick equipment because it's isotonic. Um, so he said, I think this is a situation that happens when the velocity gets to about 80% of max, or you've got about sort of in the 80% range of max resistance. Um, that you can do those two, or the third variant, of course, is if you've got 80% of max resistance and you've got 80% of max velocity or above, then of course you're going to trigger this even more. So, and that sort of struck a bell with me, and I thought, shit, yeah, he's got something there. And so I was looking at this from a little bit different view, but virtually we had the same idea. So that was what drove our strength and conditioning on Randy's side and on my side, and that was to chase after what was going on eccentrically. And I measured this by looking at TPV, so time to peak velocity, or eccentric rate of force development. Now, if we fast forward only to a few months ago, actually, Professor John Cronin from New Zealand and Professor Sato in Japan have now put a name to this phenomenon that Randy calls DIS, and that it's now called the filament winding theory. And what happens is in the later parts of the eccentric phase, myosin and actin don't move. They actually become isometric. And there's a third substance called titin, which acts as a spring, and it allows that myosin and actin can actually move, but they're not actually moving independently. They're moving together. So they are isometric. And the titin is actually what's allowing this system to work isometrically. And that is like, really? And that, now we're sort of finding out that there's a winding going on with a calcium compound that winds. And I've heard some discussions now that depending on the angle of this wind, that's going to also dictate how strong this binding is, and what is it that dictates if it's going to be a vertical or let's say an angular wind up on the filament. We don't know that at the moment. That's for Professor Cronin and Sato to investigate. But what that means is that we now know that we have athletes. For example, if you think about Sue, and he's in the ground, he's getting off the ground in 74 milliseconds. But what is actually happening is that is the total time, because he's also got the landing where he's compressing the spring and then he's getting off, and that whole time is 74 milliseconds, which means that he's actually, if we want to sort of look at it this way, he's compressing the spring, but he's doing it probably in maybe 25, 30 milliseconds. And then it's taking him 40 milliseconds to get out of there. And that total time is the loading of the spring and the unloading of the spring, and the rest of the time it takes him to get off the ground. And that total time is 74 milliseconds. So in other words, he's able to load his spring massively quick with huge amounts of energy very, very rapidly. And that we think is very, very much genetic. How much genetic it is. We're sort of be throwing around figures by the sheer numbers of these people that are coming in and out, because they're not very many that have got this type of a capacity. So you might be looking at it that this is 80% genetic. So there are, the people who can do these crazy results, they are part of that. Does that mean then that if you don't have this genetic makeup, you're never going to run faster than 100? No, because we've seen that if we put people into, if I want to sort of call it our system, people start running fast. We can take the young fellow they got in Australia. Now, he was a guy who was running 1050s. He had a PB of 1040, which he'd run once, but he was a 1050 runner. Now he's running 1014. He's run a couple of races a little bit quicker with a little bit more, too much wind, but not very much. He's run 10, 11, 10, 13, 10, 15, or 10, yeah. So 10, 11 is the fastest he's gone. And in that, he ran about 11.75 meters per second, which is very fast, very, very fast. We've got a couple of girls in Sweden that have sort of that for years, for 3, 4, 5 years, they were just plateauing, nothing. Then they decided through another coach here in Sweden that I work with, Kenneth Rigbody, who was head coach of the Malmo Sports Academy until he retired. And he's a guy who does all the muscle lab crunching the numbers for me. And he introduced our training system to a former national coach in Sweden, and he started coaching a couple of these girls. Now, one of them, she set a new national record last weekend. She ran 23:01 indoors for the 200. And this is a girl who was running sort of 23:07 outdoors and had, she was stuck at that speed. And she ran 7:24 and is now number 3 all time in Sweden, or 7:22 over the 60 meters. And this was a girl, again, she was a 7 sort of 40, 50 girl and was stuck there. And all of a sudden, bang, she's knocked 2/10 of a second off. She's knocked 3/4 of a second off her 200-meter time. And I mean, if you can run 23 flat indoors, this is somebody, she'll probably run 22:7 outdoors. That's decent running. That's not bad at all by anyone's standards. So we know that people you put into this system, and I mean, probably the biggest star of those is Sue, of course, who Randy worked with in China. I mean, here's a guy who the Chinese said, "Oh, he's done. He's finished. He's 28 or whatever he was. He's finished. He's run like 10:10 or whatever he'd run. He's not going to run any faster. We're going to pension him off." And Randy said, "No, no, no. Come on, give him to me. Give him to me." The rest is history. He's now run a 9:83. He's 14th fastest of all time, and he's run a 6:29.60, which is just crazy. I get goosebumps when I watch that Tokyo final. I mean, that first 40, 50 meters is just insane. I mean, he just pulls away from these guys. They just look like they're standing still. It's ridiculous. We've seen what we've done with the long jumpers. And I had a kid in Hong Kong who was stuck at 770 for 3, 4 years. It took 9 months, and he was jumping over 8 meters. So we know that when you do this protocol, things start to happen, because we're now sort of targeting what is primary, and that is to load the eccentric phase, because that is what matters. And the prime, or the big thing is that you've got to do it with velocity. Velocity is the key. But this has got to be done in a progression. You can't go down and all of a sudden go, right, I'm going to start doing fast eccentric squats and just go gung ho, away you go. That's probably not the best way of doing it. This is going to take some time. But like I said, we've had athletes that have sort of, after 10 months, have done some extraordinary big, PBs. So it's definitely possible.
Yeah.
But you need a systematic approach. So that was the long answer. To DIS is dynamic isometric strength. So it is a condition of an isometric state within the later parts of the eccentric phase, which very, very rapidly stores elastic energy and that you can utilize as an athlete.
Yeah, yeah. I love it. I love it. So, um, don't hate me for like don't hate me for like asking this stupid question.
No, no.
But like, so I think 2 weeks ago when I asked Randy, he said, so actually at late swing phase at max velocity, it's actually isometric. So it's
Mm,
actually like eccentric and isometric. So what he
mm,
called dynamic isometric strength.
mm.
So what my question is, isn't that kind of like coincide with what Franz Bosch said, like during late swing phase, max velocity, it's isometric? Don't hate me for asking that.
Yeah, this is, this, there are certain things that, and certain body parts, and the swing phase is one of those things where, when you sort of look at the leg retraction, what actually transpires. I mean, a lot of people will say if you try to push for too long, then you destroy your stride. And I think it's, for me, it's, I try to simplify everything, because I'm not as smart as all these other guys, so I've got to sort of simplify and think logically. So for me, it's like if you stand up and you got your arm at 90 degrees, and you think that you're going to grab, let's say you're running, and the action is that you've got a shelf at about nose height, and you're going to swing your arm up high enough so you can grab a glass that's on that shelf, and then you're going to throw that glass at your feet, which means you're going to open up your elbow, and it's not going to be dead straight, your arm, but it's going to have, get fairly straight. It'll swing back violently, and it'll stretch all the fascia in your upper torso, in your pecs, in your shoulder, your bicep tendon, and then it will retract from that. Okay, so there's a lot of fascia going on, and tendon, and soft tissue that is being stretched, and also, of course, muscle. Um, so the question is then, if sort of in that phase, that is there an isometric situation in the leg swing? Well, some people say there is, some people say there's not. I must say, I don't really, I don't think I really have a view of that. Like I said, I'm more inclined to sort of look at it from a fascial point of view, that you've got to be loose but tight, so that you can utilize elasticity. And this goes, along the lines of what Randy usually says, for example, that, one, and this I copped a lot of criticism over, because I said this about a year ago, that probably the biggest limiting factor to running real fast is actually elasticity. So your ability to be able to reposition. So if you can't get the wheel around and get ready to push back down again, or pull back down again, then it's game over. And that's one of the things then that is interesting to look at, because how do you build up elasticity, and what does that constitute? Um, and usually what we find is that people who've got no elasticity have done a lot of training, which is very, very similar training. And they tend to have done a lot of heavy squats, and many times they become too muscle bound, which means that the muscle itself, the muscle belly itself, is the culprit. It simply can't stretch fast enough, and retract fast enough. And I think that's where you get the limiting factor, is that the muscle itself becomes the antagonist. The fascia and the tendons, they can stretch very, very fast, but the muscle won't, because it's just been conditioned not to do that. So yeah, it's an interesting question. And I mean, if we look at sort of like, we know that, for example, if you're looking at horizontal velocity, it's related to leg angle, of the angle of attack of the leg. So in other words, if you want to increase speed, a flatter leg angle will increase speed. And that makes sense, because a flatter leg angle means it's a shorter distance between 2 points. So you're going to be able to get from A to B faster. which is the same thing when we're, for example, when we're accelerating. We don't want the foot to go back up and around and then come back because it's got to travel so much further. So hence, this discussion about the first 4 to 6 steps. Should you drag your feet or your toes or not? Well, not you don't really need to drag your toes because if you look at Sue, for example, he's not that super low, but if you look at sort of where his foot is compared to his tibia, it's about halfway up to his knee. It doesn't come much higher than that in his first 4 to 6 strides, and I think that's the key, to keep it there and to keep the leg angle of the tibia angle. And I mean, that's, the research that's come out lately, we know from that it's not how much power you can or force you can generate, it's how you generate it or where you generate it. So in other words, we're talking about force vectors. So instead of being able to produce 300 newtons or 3,000 newtons, you can actually get out of the blocks and run faster if you can produce 2,000, but you're pushing and it's moving in the right direction, which means, your body angle, shin angles, your ground contact time, your ankle stiffness, all of these things have got to be optimized so that there's no leaks. And once that's done, then you can apply force and you can get away very, very quickly with less force. So we know that then that we also know that the actual pendulum itself, the length and hip muscle, they actually determine the running height and the swing duration. So, if you've got a low hip, well, that's not going to help you at all because you're not going to be able to utilize the pendulum to its full effect. It'll be sort of swinging underneath you rather than retracting back and forth. So it's going to have a much longer way to move if you're sitting down. So there are certain things there that technically that we should be trying to do, and we try to do with what we're doing in the gym, and some of the exercises we do, like your skip A's, your skip B's, and your straight leg running for different reasons, for distance and for speed. All of those are designed to keep a high hip position so that you can attack the ground from above and not from below. You've got to come from above.
Yeah. So, I personally agree with you when you say like the elasticity and the ability to reposition the limb. And
Mm.
and uh interesting enough, like Randy also mentioned this like two weeks ago. Actually kind of said the same thing. So and to go back to like the dynamic isometric strength to the max velocity, can I understand this way? At late swing phase, muscle actually do isometric contraction, but the fascia or like the tendon, the other tissue are doing eccentric. So that's why there's
Yeah,
like debate
yeah,
about it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And this is the problem. I mean, we it's very difficult to look at these muscle actions at high velocity because, I mean, the best way of doing this is using, for example, EMG, but then you need to do not surface EMG, you need to do with needles. Now, to run at maximum velocity and have an athlete look like a pincushion, like he's just been to a what do you call it, a acupuncturist, and then a lot of wires and everything taped to his back and some sort of a receiver that's collecting all this data. I mean, nobody's going to allow it. I can just see, for example, if Randy and I would have gone to the COC and said, "Look, we want to do this with Sue," I mean, we probably would have gotten shot. You know, this is what you. I mean, this is the problem. This is what you do with college students. You know, sedentary college students, and you do your dissertation as a PhD student, and you write a lovely paper, and you go yada yada yada, and this is what we found. Yeah, okay, but you're talking about people that are not actively fit. You're not talking about people that have done 10 years of what we call chimney training, in other words, high performance training at world class level. They're a completely different machine. It's like comparing a Formula One car with a lawnmower. Yeah, they've got four wheels and they've got an engine, but that's it. Forget it. The
Yeah,
rest is
yeah,
like there's no comparison.
yeah,
So how you can sort of say that, well, this is what we found here. It's got four wheels and an engine, but it's virtually the same as a Ferrari. No, it's not.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know,
I agree. So this is actually like the conversation with me and Joseph Coyne, and it's the same with me and Coach Boo. Like I
yeah,
was asking about them, like man, there's like more and more technology. There's like velocity-based training, there's like force plate, there's like 3D motion capture,
yeah,
1080, whatever it is. But people nowadays still hire like you guys, you, Randy, Dan Paff, Coach Boo, Joseph Quinn. These coaches like they're like I'm not saying they don't use technology, but like they go way back. And there are more and more research down there. We still have these coaches to consult. I'm like, why? You know what Joseph Coyne said? He said like, because most of the research are worthless. We work with high level athlete, and those researchers they just find like some college student to do that's not useful.
no,
That's
no,
not real life.
no, no, no. And I mean, it's great. I mean, and there's people think that you're knocking, all these guys who have got PhDs. No, definitely not. But we've got to sort of, you've got to look, at the thing from the perspective: is this viable? Is this viable information? Can I use this? I mean, I've got shelf of a bunch of shelves behind me with all sorts of weird and wonderful um, projects that have been done, and dissertations and so forth. Can I use them? I mean, I try to read at least one scientific article a day. That's sort of my goal. I've been doing that probably for about the last 20 years. So I've read a few. How many of those can I actually use? Some of the stuff that you read, you might be able to do something, in a situation where either, okay, well, that's an interesting, I remember that. Yeah, why don't we try that in the GP phase for 2 weeks and see what happens? Or you'll talk to the physio, say, look, I read this article about blah blah blah. How about we try that and see, because we're not getting a response on this treatment or whatever. And that's what usually happens, because we're not gonna grab a piece of information with somebody who's done something on a college student and who says, well, this is the latest greatest way of increasing quadricep strength. Okay, but running 100 meters is not about quadricep strength. You should maybe go to the cyclists or the speed skaters, or maybe the weightlifters. But having massive big quads is not going to do it in sprinting. It's the posterior chain. So yeah, to start off with. So and if you look at it, to be honest, who's driving science? It's actually us coaches, because what we're doing a lot of measurements, and we're doing like with DIS and everything else, and then it's up to the guys in the lab to sort of try to sort out and figure out what the hell are these guys saying? What is DIS? What the hell is that? What are they? They're doing all these measurements, and they're saying that there's something happening in the eccentric phase when you do this and that. And then they get in there and they start doing some lab work, and bang, all of a sudden they see, shit, there's things happening here. Okay, that's interesting. Why is that happening? And then all of a sudden, bang, here it is. There's the filament winding theory. And this is something Randy has been working, and virtually me as well, but on a different approach angle. But this has been the basis of our strength and conditioning for the last 20 years. And now all of a sudden, science is saying, oh, there's a thing called the filament winding theory. Yeah, okay, well, that's great. But, we've been working with this. And then people say, oh, is there any peer reviews? I mean, I had some guy, who texted me and he said, yeah, but is anybody can collaborate this? I said, don't need it. And he said, why? He said, because we've got guys who jump like, 895, 840. They run 980, little Chinaman. We got people running this, jumping that, doing this. People setting huge PBs that have sort of haven't done anything for 4 or 5 years. You put them in this program, that happens. That's the results. That's it. I mean, in our business, it's results. If we do an intervention and nada happens, well, then that intervention for some reason is not working. Okay, so scratch, fiddle, fiddle. Okay, let's go home and redo a few things, and away we go again. And we might do 2 6 weeks blocks to 12 weeks later. Oh, damn, things have happened here. Well, that's interesting. So this is what drives us forward, and this is why we use technology. We don't use technology to sort of be smart asses and say, oh, look at all the metrics I've got. No, we use technology actually to question what we're doing. We question our beliefs every bloody week, virtually, and that's why we use technology. We want to sort of the knowledge that we have about the training process. Can we better it? Can we understand it better? Can I do things better? Do we need to do this much work, or can we actually do a little bit less work and get better results? That's the sort of thing that drives us, because at the end of the day, the number one thing, we've always got to remember that, and that is health. The athlete needs to be healthy. It doesn't matter how talented you are. You can be the biggest genetic freak of all time, but if you're injured, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because you can't compete. So you've got to be healthy. And that's where strength and conditioning comes in. Strength and conditioning isn't sort of the thing that makes you run or throw further. What it does is it allows you to do what actually is the most important thing, and that is to throw the javelin or do the shot put or run very, very fast. But you can do it more often at a higher intensity, and hence the body adapts to that, and then it drives other things, and things get stronger, and we can then do more work, and increase density, increase work capacity. That's what strength training does. It allows for the athlete to do the event more often at a higher intensity without breaking. So the thing is, and this is where DIS is so important, because what we can do with DIS, we can move the strength training that was, like we were saying, with these long time to peak velocity in many movements, we can move those with other movements much, much closer. So now we're here from the gym to what we're doing on the track. And then it's easier to transfer this by using, for example, speed bounds and single leg bounds, some 1080 equipment and that sort of thing. That ties in, and now we can sort of move all the way to what we're actually doing in the event itself. But if we didn't have that approach, we'd have strength training stuck way over here, and the only time you're going to get any sort of big results happening is when these genetic freaks turn up, because they do turn up. I mean, there's no doubt that there are some people that pop up every once in a while that just absolutely turns everything upside down. But that doesn't drive sport. That's sort of they're the what's it called? What's the right word? They're the anomaly. They're not the norm. So we've got to sort of try to normalize training and get it to work, for everybody, or for the athletes that are in the program. So strength training has got to be different, and grinding and doing what I did as an athlete. it doesn't work. Well, it does work, but it works for a period when you are young, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, and you are maturing biologically. And then if things don't change, you've already sort of set the whole framework, and then it just tilts over. And once you get up to there, nothing happens. And that's when you get athletes who all of a sudden, they sort of peak at 21 and nothing happens 22, 23, 24, 25. They're still doing the same results. And they're training, 9, 10, 11 sessions a week, and they're grinding away and nothing happens because what they're doing is wrong because there was no progression. And I think that's the biggest thing with Randy's training is that Randy has a progression and a thinking pattern of progression that we move through exercises. And this is one of the things that I think was instrumental when I came to China, because I'd had very little influence and what do you call it, exposure to Kaiser. And I said to Randy, and Randy said to me, you should really go over and have a look at this, and that with the Kaisers, and then have a look at this when you're doing the Kaiser rack. And he said, EMS combo. And I said, okay. And he said, you watch what happens in the eccentric phase. And I went, yeah, righto, yep. Yawn. Went over there, came back, and it just looked at me, and he said, works, doesn't it? And I went, shit. That is insane, because then this is what people, and I mean, I hear people say this all the time. Well, Kaiser's got no eccentric phase. Rubbish. It's got an absolutely murderous eccentric phase because air technology works faster than gravity. So it wants to move faster than 9.8 meters per second squared. So in other words, if you load up 150 kilos on a rack over here, and on the other rack, you put 75 kilos of air, 75 kilos of mass, 150 kilos, and go boom, 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 3 fast squats, and then do 3 fast squats here. Guess what? Over here, the eccentric phase is anywhere between 25 and 40% more strenuous. In other words, there's so much more happening in the eccentric phase. So that means that you're going to have to break, and that dynamic isometric strength phase will be much, much more aggressive than it is over here. So once you realize that, then it's a matter of looking at every piece of equipment and every exercise you're using and categorizing them. Okay, what do they do with a set weight? Like you grab, maybe I did 2 weights, like 70 and 100 kilos. And then you move them as fast as you can. Then you go over to that machine and you use the same weights and you bang, 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 same thing. Then all of a sudden, things start to emerge and you see patterns emerging. So those machines over there, we can forget those. They're a complete waste of time. Rehabilitation, general fitness, fine. High performance sports in speed power events, forget it. It's just a waste of time. And then you realize, okay, these exercises and these we can use. Okay, so now we've got to sort of bring those guys, these machines and these exercises in, and then we've got to sort of pull them apart. And this is when a lot of people say, so you guys do a lot of partials. Yep, we do a lot of partials. Why? Because look at where you are, how much hip flexion and how much knee flexion have you got in support phase when you land on the track? There's virtually nothing. You nearly got a straight leg. So where does the maximum sort of deep squat ass to the grass come in? Well, 2 steps coming out of the blocks, and then that's all over. So after that, it's, the angle opens up and you're virtually, landing on a straight leg. You're pulling. It bends, of course it does. It opens and shuts very, very rapidly the knee joint. But that's another discussion. But once you hit the track, you are in a very, very sort of straight position. So in other words, you've got to be able to generate very, very high and fast forces from very, very small flexion and extension. It's very, very quick. So it makes no sense then to do lots of very, very long movements when actually at peak velocity, the movement is very, very short and very, very explosive. So we do partials to sort of transfer to move this over here and tie in with other exercises so that we can get a transfer. And once you've got that figured out, then it becomes sort of, well, not, I wouldn't say easy, but it becomes a hell of a lot easier, because now all of a sudden I've got a sequence where I can sort of work. So for example, I'll start my guys with cleans from the floor because I know what TPV is that. And we do 2 weeks of that. Then we have a recovery week, and then we have an intensification 2 weeks. Then we'll do hang cleans. Then we have a recovery week, and then we're going to do another 6 weeks phase. But then the lift that was the intensification becomes the accumulation. So then the hang cleans are the slow movement, but they're fast because now we've moved everything up. And then the next phase, after we've done the 2 weeks and 1 week recovery, we'll do a drop hang clean because that's more strenuous. It means that we've got a bigger force eccentrically, which means we've got to work harder to get out of that position. So everything speeds up. So now we've had an exercise that started here, went to there, and went to there. So it's gone bing, bing, bing. And now all of a sudden, you've got a progression of acceleration. And as I said, the big thing that people get wrong is that everybody thinks power is the number one metric. It's not. The number one metric, in my opinion, is acceleration, because force is mass times that acceleration. So without the acceleration, there's not much force. Not much is going to happen at all. And if there's not much force, then it doesn't matter how much velocity you've got, because you're not going to get much power. And power is then also dependent on the length of the movement. And this is also something that people sort of get back to us and say, I was looking at this, and, the guys were doing 3,000 watts in the deep squat, and then we did these partials, and they're only doing 1,800. That's no good. We've lost 1,200 watts. Yeah, but you've picked up sort of like 30% in acceleration. And that's the thing that's going to get you off the ground. It's not sort of power that's happening way over here. It's acceleration that's happened here. That's going to get you off the ground. Not this guy. It's this guy. And when you say that to some people, it's sort of like, ding, yep, they get it. And then some people just stand there, look at you, no, sorry, and they just walk away.
I have to say, like, this is just brilliant to me. This is just brilliant. I like when I talk to Joseph Coyne, when I talk to Randy, like you guys are like another level. Like time to peak, like TPV, time to peak velocity. Am I right?
Yep.
It's just amazed me. I love
Yeah,
that.
it's an interesting metric. And the other thing that we found with TPV, it's actually probably the best marker for neural fatigue, because we do a very simple test where we take a 20 kilo bar, we get the guys to do a squat jump, and then we get a measurement, a time to peak velocity. Now, the most difficult thing for the human body to do is to move light objects fast. So in other words, if you want to test your neural fatigue levels, you do so with as light a weight as you see, as you see fit, and also is bound by what event am I doing. So in this case, we're always dealing with our body weight, trying to accelerate or jump off the ground or throw something. So a 20 kilo object is for an elite athlete is light. So therefore, it's a good measurement, and we've been doing this for 25 years. And we can then do a test with, for example, our athletes when they're in peak form. We'll get them warm up, bang, they'll do 3 jumps. Okay, there's our number. It could be, let's say, 120 milliseconds. So then we know that their nervous system, when they're fully rested and in peak shape, it's 120 milliseconds. Now, if we're doing stuff throughout the year and all of a sudden, I'm looking at, the guys and they're looking a bit ragged, they warm up, get a bar out, boom, 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 3 jumps, they're doing 200 milliseconds. Well, hang on, 200 milliseconds, that's still, people would say, oh, that's still pretty quick. Yeah, but his best is 120. So we've added 80 milliseconds. How much is that? Well, that's about 70%. So we've just slowed down 70%. Are you telling me that if you're a sprinter or a power guy, you've slowed things down by 70%? That's okay. In our world, no, 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 no. Sorry, it's sort of
Yeah.
like where we are, 25-30%. That's it. If you're further back than that, like pull the handbrake, have a rest, go do something else, get a massage, or there's something we're doing. You're tired. You're neurally too tired, and if you're neurally tired, we can't do what we're supposed to do, and that is these fast explosive movements. So TPV is an extremely good indicator for neural readiness.
Nice, nice. So, I also talked with Coach Wu Bushexner about like neuromuscular fatigue, and she said like there's three stages of like neuromuscular fatigue. The first stage, you can't really get that from technology because it happens with like the refined motor control movement. So, maybe
Yep.
like skill, and the second phase you can get from technology, which is like coincide with you said is like time to peak velocity.
Mm,
And the third state is peak power or mean power.
mm.
So
Yep.
it's interesting that all of like these legendary track coaches are saying the same thing. Like and there's like literally no research, no
No,
literature.
no, 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 none. Um, I mean, we like Jacob, for example, he has an aura ring that he sleeps with, and Randy, for example, uses Omega Wave. I mean, he started with Omega Wave, and he's a huge proponent of Omega Wave, which I sort of got introduced to when I was working with Randy in China, um, and that's interesting. And I think there's a lot that you can get out of that. Um, what I like about TPV is it's so sort of unobtrusive. It sort of doesn't. It's not in your. It's not something you've got to have on, and you've got to sort of. There's an app to it, and you've got to look at. You got to follow diagrams, and you get numbers like it. My score this morning is 49. Like if it's under 50 on an Aura ring, that means you're sick. Right? Okay. Well, it's 49. Oh, that's not mentally such a great thing to wake up in the morning and you look at your watch there and it's 49. Oh shit. I'm probably sick. you know maybe that's a good idea because then you probably shouldn't go to the track anyway, but I just like the fact that it's so easy to do this test. It's just they warm up, they get in there, bang 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 bang. And we've been doing this for so long, and we've sort of learned that in that spectrum, because it is very, very sensitive. And I'm not saying I disagree with the three phases, but I do believe that TPV, if you're doing it long enough, you're going to learn your athlete in different stages. So you'll know where they should be in the GP. Where are they going to be during the max velocity, max strength phase? Where are they going to be when we're doing most of the speed endurance work? And in this, like the end of the second week, or at the start of the first week after a week of recovery, for example. So you learn this as a coach, and sort of then when you see these figures, okay, if it's 200 over here and it was 160 over there, no, we're super fatigued. So look, we're going to have to do something completely different in the next 3 days, because this guy, he needs 72 hours at least, maybe 96 to recover. So I think it's a matter of sort of how long have you been tracking things, and how well do you actually know what the metrics are doing, and are you following them throughout their cycles of training. And then once you get on board with that, then it's sort of it's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't say that's the only reason, but I've never had a hamstring injury in my groups. I've had inflammations in insertions and stuff like this. I've had athletes who've had tendinopathies, but they've often come to me with tendinopathy, and then you sort of you battle around that to keep them healthy. But Randy's the same. We've never had a hamstring tear in our whole career. Now,
Nice. That man, you guys work with track and never have a hand. That's amazing.
yeah, and the thing is that we don't do Nordic hamstrings. we could probably do a whole podcast on just that exercise alone because I got myself into hot water. I
I'm gonna
said to a I
I'm gonna
said to a
ask
coach,
Randy to do that. I'm gonna ask Andy to do that with you.
do that. Yeah, I'd love to see that one. Yeah, I was in a bad mood one day, and there was a guy, and he does a lot of really good stuff. And I'm gonna say it like it is. It's a coach called Kuma Jumper, an Asian coach, and he does a lot of really good stuff. But they were doing some Nordic hamstrings, and I do not like Nordic hamstrings. They just no, 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 no. They're just too slow. You've got to realize that about 80 to 90%, if you depending on how straight you are, but between 80 and 90% of your body weight is what you're going to be lowering down. So if you weigh 70 kilos, you're looking at somewhere between, what's 8 times 7? That's 56 to 9 to 60. So somewhere around 60 kilos is the load that you're going to do very, very slowly. We've got variations of that. Randy does a different. We do raises, for example. You know what raises are? You
Oh
back
yeah,
in, and then
yeah,
you protrude outwards.
yeah.
That's different. I do, for example, what I like is hamstring sliders on the floor, where
Oh
you keep going,
yeah,
or
yeah,
you do just eccentric one leg, and then pull it back, and then slow. So we can do that, for example. But that's different, because that is nowhere near that load, and it is you're still doing a fairly quick movement. Um, but yeah, Nordic hamstring. I've seen some football clubs, for example, that have started Nordic hamstrings, and it took 3 months, and then the whole team were, had hamstring injuries. And then for the next 2 years, the club was they had so many hamstring injuries, it was ridiculous. And I said to them, maybe you shouldn't have done Nordic hamstrings. And they thought, yeah, well, do you think that's the reason? I said, yeah, it's a it's just a wild guess, but yeah, I think so. You know, so Randy does, for example, what Randy does, he does a variation of that where we hold, for example, a weight on our chest, and we'll be on the what do you call it, we call it the belly back, or the on the cushion that you do your hamstring work, and
yeah, yeah.
and your torso raises. So you you go down very quickly with the weight. So you're eccentrically braking very quickly. You drop the weight, and then you go back and you pull yourself back. Now that's different. That's completely different. And we do a lot of exercises like that. Uh, but like a Nordic hamstring, nope,
Yeah, I
never done
got
them.
you.
Never done them.
Yeah,
Um,
uh, I think I had like the same experience that I can't say the athlete's name. He's a pro athlete. Work with a professional team right now. So, but he never have a hamstring issue until like one day he like changed, switched the team, and then the team do like all those like strength testing. So, oh, his hamstring was weak. Then all of a sudden he started to do Nordic hamstring curl. And then what happened is the first year, tear his hamstring big time. And the second year, when he got back from hamstring tear, tears ACL. This kid never tear his hamstring in his life. He was a like pro athlete. But after that, just never come back.
mm,
Yeah, just a shame. Just a shame.
mm. Yeah, no, no, yeah, no. It's one of those exercises that and the problem is that um, a lot of people do them. You know, even if you do them, and if there are sports where you can do them. I mean, the other thing you got to realize is we open and shut our knee joints very, very rapidly. So, in other words, the hamstrings are doing things at a velocity which is crazy when you're sprinting very fast. I mean, these guys are taking 4.7 to 5 steps a second. That's the velocity. That's the frequency. So the hamstrings are getting an enormous amount of exposure to high velocities and high forces. And again, if you're doing something that's way over here, what are you going to transfer? Because the transfer is running quick, but what are you going to do over from that? I mean, you'd have to do so many other
Yeah.
exercises to get over somewhere where it's going to transfer. And that is my point. That's what I've got against Nordic hamstring. I think I think one, they're too severe, and number two is to get anything out of them, you've got to do so many more
Yeah.
exercises. So you're going to spend the whole day in the gym just sort of doing hamstring exercises to even out, from what you've done with these Nordic hamstrings. So, I'm sorry, but it doesn't work.
Yeah.
It makes no sense.
Yeah, I got you. I got you. So I'm gonna jump out like hamstring curl. I want to ask about like I know we kind of discussed this before, but still I want to talk about like what's so called the France boss system. And I want to start with you kind of already talk about it. I want to start with what's so called swing leg retraction. So, can you like explain a little like what is swing leg retraction and is it a thing that we can implement it?
Well, as I said, I think a lot of the gait as running is done by fascia, and I think there's more and more evidence that we haven't really understood fascia and just how incredibly strong it is and what it does. We've sort of been saying that this is tendon strength and this is elasticity in the muscle, and the fascia has sort of been this guy that there's so like a sheath of something like a rubbery substance down there, and well it's sort of it's there and it protects the muscle and it's like a sheet and it does this and that, and it there's fascias around different muscle groups and so forth. And yeah, righto. But what does it actually do? Well, one thing it does most certainly do is when you stretch things, and the fascial slings that you've got from your that goes from your left knee up to your right shoulder, there and from your right knee to your left shoulder, that cross that's what drives everything. It's these two moving and creating enormous tensions that you're pulling out and releasing and actuating that by using a muscular system to get itself into biomechanical positions where you can utilize, and amongst other things, velocities that are built up by using elasticity. And I think this is one of the things that the Bosch system does. It works a lot of elasticity. It's a lot of coordination, because one of the things that people fail to realize is that when you're going to do something like run very quickly, you've got to have something which is called inter and intramuscular coordination. So that means that there are muscle groups with groups of muscle within the muscle that have got to work together, and then there are bundles of muscles in different areas that have got to work together in a technically sound model to be able to exert as much force into the ground as possible, in our case, to propel us forward. So, these things, you need to build inter and intramuscular coordination, and that is one of the reasons why Randy sort of has had this influence on and his way of thinking is that velocity is the key. It's not sort of grinding away. It's always being introduced to velocities and trying always to sort of keep the nervous system guessing and introduce in a wave manner different types of velocities, but generally high velocities with or without load, so that we can utilize these elastic components to our advantage. And I think, and what for me, I mean, this is my take on it, and that is that the Bosch system is more or less it's a coordinative um, um, it's a coordinative thing. In other words, you learn athletes different movement patterns and how to put different body segments in the right position at the right time. So firing orders are going to be correct. That you're not overpowering something that shouldn't be doing. So I think that's the biggest thing with the Bosch system is it learns coordination, and it's a technical. In many things you can learn athletes technically how to, for example, how to strike the ground, how to what should they be doing with their feet, which is some people say that it doesn't matter, and some people like we think that you've got to have a certain amount of dorsiflexion to signal to the calf muscle to pre-activate before you hit the ground. And I saw this firsthand back in I'm trying to think, 1990. There was a former East German biomechanic guy that came to Sweden. He was doing some lectures, and he did some electric stimulation. In other words, he put some surface EMG pads on the calf muscle of an athlete, and then he used an infrared sensor to trigger this. So what basically happened was that the athlete had to do a drop jump from 30 centimeters and then get off the ground as quick as possible and jump as high as possible. And this was a girl that was jumping, I think, about 160, 170 milliseconds in that time frame from that 30 centimeter box. Then he put a little small battery that was charging this, and then he put the pads on her calf muscles, and then she jumped off the box, and she went through the lights that triggered the impulse. So in other words, there was a very quick, short burst of electricity into a calf muscle that pre-tensed the calf muscle. It didn't do very much with the feet. It was just that the calf muscle itself got a pre-activation, and whips. Her contact times went from about 167 down to 137. So that for me was sort of like, well, then there's no discussion. If you're going to get everything out of the system, you're going to have dorsal flexion when you run. There's no doubt about it. If you don't have dorsal flexion, you've got leaks. And then, of course, comes the next part. Okay, so you've got dorsal flexion and nothing still's happening. Well, that usually is the case that then you've got no soleus muscle. So then you need to build the soleus muscle, which was the case with Sue, with Randy. We talked about this, I think, only the other day. And I asked Randy, what was his figures when you first worked with him? And he said, it's like 600-700 watts. It was crazy little. There was other athletes who were doing 12, 14, 1500, and they weren't very good at all. And Sue was doing like 700 watts. Now he pushes 3,000 watts. When he was at his peak running, his best times, he's pushing 3,000 watts, which is a massive big difference, which now means that when he lands on the ground, his foot and his lower leg can actually start working immediately. And once that happened, this is when he could then exploit the DIS that was there, most probably naturally. But the leak that he had that meant that nobody could ever see that he actually had this capacity because he had no soleus muscle. So the soleus muscle has got to be able to withstand these forces and have this amount of stiffness to be able then to work within the what we call DIS. So I think it's there's a lot to do with, and I think the Bosch system has its biggest advantages. I think is in long term athletic development. I think that's where it should be, and then I think you can take certain elements of it out as part of activation, warm ups, and so forth for sprinting, which people do, of course. But I don't necessarily think that you need to sort of do like I said earlier, that there are certain individuals that sort of have taken this to a virtually, to a competitive event where they just do a crazy amount of, of Franz Bosch drills, or the other one that everybody was doing was Mac drills from Gerard Mack, was also a big um, guy with when it came to doing different types of running drills and tripping and skipping and so forth. And everybody went Mac, it was like everybody was doing just thousands of them. Do you need to do that? Not really. I think once you've got sort of to a certain level and it's there and it's working, then you sort of move on. And then you need to build capacity in those areas where, for example, like Sue, where you're deficient, because then you can utilize that those attributes to their full extent. And I think this is where I think that's one of the things that I admire most about Randy. I think is he's a genius at finding leaks. It's crazy. He has this knack of looking at an athlete and he'll just say, right, there's the three leaks. Let's fix that. And then somebody else will be standing there going, well, what about his feet? What about them? Yeah, well, they're flat. Well, so what? Is there something wrong with them? No. Okay, don't fix them. Next. it's it's Randy says this quite often. He says, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And I think that's one thing that as young coaches, we all made the mistakes. We saw athletes and we're going to fix them, but maybe you don't need to fix everything, because the human body has this ability to be able to sort of adjust and compensate. I mean, if we look at our Mr. Bolt, he's got scoliosis and he's extremely right side dominant with his leg action. It's crazy, the right side bias that he has, and he's run 9:58. So the question is, if you fix all that, is he still going to run? Is he going to run 9:48? No, I don't think he will. No, no. That's the crazy thing, So that alone there, that sort of that is, again, this is we don't understand everything about training. We don't. We're sort of still scratching the surface, because there are things that the human body does at time to time that we don't understand how it does it, but it does it. And how do we utilize that? Can we do this often? And can we harness certain things? We don't know, because we simply don't know how to tap into it.
Nice, nice. So, man, I literally asked different questions for you and for Randy, and you guys answering about the same thing. Like, like he was saying like DIS, he was saying soulless muscle, and when I asked him about like fascia-based athlete and muscle-based athlete, he was saying, "Oh, there's no such thing. The only thing is if the athlete is coordinated enough to access his fascia." And you were saying the same thing, coordination, muscle. You,
Yeah.
Maybe that's why he wanted me to do this one with you. That's, you guys are like you guys are interested, but like
Well, it's either that or we're completely indoctrinated by the Randy Huntington, I don't know what we're going to call it, the doctrine. So we're all brainwashed.
yeah, probably all brainwashed by it. So um just to just to make a summary about like what we were saying about like the swing leg retraction is basically what we want our athlete to do when they're in like max velocity, strike at the right position, activating the hip muscle, strike at the right position. Instead of like push all the way through, right?
Well, if you think about it, if you push all the way through, that's going to take time.
Yeah.
That's the thing. You want to make this sort of like you violently do something, and then you let everything sort of take its course. So in other words, the other thing that's going to drive this is the ground reaction force. And that is also something that Randy is a big proponent of. He tells his athletes to feel the ground,
Yeah.
because, and which is, when you hear this the first time, you go, feel the ground. What's he on about now? Like, what? But when you have athletes that, you've heard the expression, they're spinning their wheels. So they come out of the blocks and their legs just go like, but they're going nowhere. It looks very, very nice, and it looks like, wow, he's moving fast. But the clock says no, he's not. Look, it's nothing's happening. Um, so spinning the wheels is not the answer. And the reason is because they simply don't have they're not in they're pulling their feet off the ground before the ground reaction force can do its thing. So in other words, you're not getting any energy back out of the track, because it works. This is what propels us forward. Um, Newton's law. You put 500 Newton into the ground, you're going to get 500 Newton back, but it's going to come at a vector which looks like that. That's what propels you down the track. Is the fact that the ground reaction force is equal to what you put in, you get out, but it's coming out as a resultant, was the word I was looking for, which is at about a 45-degree angle coming out. That's what drives you down the track. So if you're spinning your wheels and ripping your feet off the ground, you're never going to be able to get, you might put X amount into the ground, but you're not going to get X out. You're going to get X minus Y, because you're pulling everything off the ground before the ground reaction force has time to do its thing. And this is where it gets tricky. To optimize that, guess what? You need DIS. You need leg stiffness. The better the leg stiffness, the better you're going to get off the ground, and the more you're going to be able to utilize the ground reaction force. It's very simple.
Nice, nice, nice. So, uh, the other thing about like the coordination part or like coordination based, whatever it is people always talk about hip block. So, what are your takes about like hip block?
Yeah, it's what's my take on hip lock? I think yeah, I suppose it is. It is a lock, I suppose you could say, when you sort of, you get up top there and you really, you really squeeze that, and you get a nice extension out of your hip, the last sort of bit, and you sort of lock it into place, and then over the other side, lock it into place, lock it into place, lock it into place. But I think it has more to do with strengthening the hip in the sort of in the later stages of hip extension, and being able to sort of hold that position so that you don't get there and sort of can't hold it. In other words, if you can't keep your hip high and let the ground reaction force do its thing, it's not going to strike you, and you're not going to be able to utilize this because there are leaks along the way. You've got leaks from your feet or from your calf ankle complex, and you've got leaks up in your hip, because if your hip is not able to work and stay solid, then it's going to sort of be all over the place.
Nice.
If you look at, for example, what Charlie Francis was saying. Charlie was always saying, if you're going to run fast, um, your hips and your torso have got to be like a block of cement, and then now your extremities, in other words, your two legs and your two arms, they can accelerate, because there is a solid block in the middle that can withstand rotations, and it can withstand forces, which makes sense. Which makes sense.
Yeah. I love this. I love this. So I know it's like that's probably all for you today. I'm definitely gonna have you on again. I know it's like really late at Sweden, so I
No
appreciate
problem. No problem.
I appreciate you for like doing this with me. Although Randy's not on, I'm gonna invite you on to do the podcast about just only with the Nordic Hampshire girl. But
I'll let you do that one with him by himself.
I
Actually, it's interesting. Randy and I have never done a podcast together.
oh
Nope.
I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna be the first one. I'm gonna be the first one to do it. So for all those who are interested in what we're talking about today, uh you and Randy are legends. So for all those who are interested in what we're talking about, DIS, Franz Bosch, neuromuscular fatigue, uh, where can they reach out to? Where can they find your stuff? TPV.
Well, they can find me on Instagram, when I try to post some stuff every once in a while that I try to make some sense out of. So it's Tailwind Squad. It's called, and that's where, sort of, that's my platform. And yeah, so if people have got some questions and they want to bounce some ideas, and I'm also on the same thing on what is it, on X, or what used to be Twitter. Um, I think it's called that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's called X right now.
Yeah, it's called X, but am I called? Is that what I'm called? My son usually goes. There in on X, it's Rolf Ohman.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
got you.
So that's where usually we chat, especially with Move Factor X, with Scott Damon, and I've been doing a lot of talking regarding, again, elasticity, and how to best utilize it, and to get people to understand that, they shouldn't pause between their repetitions, because they're just not utilizing the full extent of elasticity. So it's much better to progress and to do your 4 or 5 reps in continuous form and fast. Therefore, after the first rep, you're building elasticity in every repetition. It just means you're going to be producing much bigger numbers, and you're working elasticity to its full extent. So we've been having a lot of discussions about that, and the EA index, and a few other things that that Scott's put into the Move X VBT device. So yeah, hop along on X and have a look, or what we're yapping on about, and then on Tailwind Squad, people can have a look on that, because I try to post some stuff. We've been doing a few posts lately on the difference between different exercises. We're breaking down a couple of exercises: cleans, snatches, and heavy clean pulls, for example. Which ones are working the posterior chain, and what sort of figures are we getting out of them, and why? So which exercise should you be using when, for example? So we've had a lively discussion with a few people on that one. So yeah, no, um, just jump in and you know have a chat with us.
Nice, nice, nice.